When you have a sanctuary filled with people who are coming to press in to God and know Him more, He shows up.
You know, there's 2 or 3 of us, and He is right in the midst.
I feel like He's just all around me, you know, like I'm being covered by His love, covered by Him, I guess.
Seeing people healed of not just physical wounds, but of the emotional wounds that go deep, that you stick a Band-Aid over and you pretend you're okay. Seeing them healed of those things and knowing that it's real healing by the way they act, the way they've changed, to me, that's real.
I've never in my life been a part of such an amazing move of God.
The presence of God is different for different churches and individual people because it's not going to be the same for everybody. He moves in a way that's individual for each one of us because each one of us has our own stories, and He's intimate. So of course it's going to look different for everybody.
The more we allow Him to have His way in our lives, it's like we see how great that treasure is and how there's nothing that we trade it for, not a thing.
People definitely have to experience it because as soon as you do, you can't go back.
As a child and then as a young pastor, Alec Rowlands witnessed extraordinary experiences of God's presence. A few years after his Cedar Rapids experience, Alec was approached by a church in the Seattle area. Over the course of 18 months, Alec and Rita came to believe that this opportunity might be a new call from God.
We were hosting a dinner for pastors in the Cedar Rapids area, and as they were leaving that evening, we felt fairly safe in asking the last couple if they would stop and pray with us. It was a retired missionary couple from the Philippines who had recently moved to the Cedar Rapids area. And when we stopped them at the doorway of the house as they were exiting, we said, would you mind praying with us about something? The missionary's wife turned to me and she said, "Oh, I already know." I said to her, "You know what?" She said, I know you and Rita are moving from Cedar Rapids. She said, "The Lord woke me up about 3 o'clock in the morning 2 or 3 weeks ago to pray for you and told me at that time that He was moving you somewhere else for ministry." That particular event, I think, provided some of the measure of security that we needed to make a bold move that would be coming for us within a few months to leave Cedar Rapids and to accept the call to the church in Seattle. When we arrived here for the 10 days of candidating, we discovered a congregation that was pretty deeply wounded. Turns out that 2 of my predecessors had had moral failures, and as a consequence, the congregation was struggling in attendance. Finances were in a serious condition. But after a week of meetings with different leadership teams and groups in the congregation, Rita and I actually found ourselves drawn to the people. I think primarily because of the woundedness we sensed in them. We arrived in the Seattle area with our moving van and family in March of 1988 to begin our 10-year of ministry at Westgate Chapel. We discovered that the reputation it had in this area was, as some called it, the Nordstrom's church of the Seattle area. The people were fairly wealthy. They were very comfortable in their lifestyles. The services themselves seemed to lack an imminent sense of God's presence and His immediacy. And for the first couple of years, I really preached my heart out to them about subjects like hunger for God, a passion for His presence. Unfortunately, I found a fairly small group within the congregation that were responsive to that. And by the end of 2 or 3 years, I think there was a growing strain, at least within me, and a sense of disillusionment, perhaps even wondering whether we had made the right decision to come to Seattle.
There was such a complacency in a big chunk of the congregation. Pastor is just preaching his heart out. And, you know, it's like I'm saying in my heart, yes, you know, this is what we're looking for. But it didn't seem to change very much.
About that time, we visited a conference held locally where Pastor Jim Simbla from the Brooklyn Tabernacle was a guest speaker. And when I heard him at this conference, heard his heart for the Lord, heard him describe what the Lord was doing in New York City and the Brooklyn Tabernacle, I sensed an immediate identification with his heart for God and what the Lord was doing there. And as soon as I could, I packed up our worship pastor and his wife and Rita and I, and we flew out to New York to catch a little bit of a vision of what the Lord was doing in that locale. What we experienced when we visited Brooklyn Tabernacle was an amazing, humble people with an incredible hunger for God that's reflected in their Tuesday night prayer meetings that are packed with people just calling on the Lord for their desperate condition and in their need for Him in their ministry to the New York area. I came back and tried to duplicate what I'd seen at Brooklyn Tabernacle and immediately called for a midweek prayer meeting. And probably 80, 90, 100 people showed up, and that prayer meeting started very enthusiastically, but I'm sorry to say lasted for about 3-4 months, and pretty soon the 100 people had dwindled down to about 10 or 15 of the faithful and didn't have any impact that I was aware of in the life of the congregation, certainly not in the ministries of the church. None of us sets out in our Christian lives with a purpose of losing our first love for the Lord. It's something that happens incrementally. And I think what had happened in the church here in Seattle was that without even being aware of it, but because of the relative comfort and ease of the lifestyle of the congregation, they had gradually lost that sense of their first love for God. There was a group of people in the congregation, 20, 30 people, who long before I came here were faithful in prayer and committed to seeing God be glorified in this congregation and in this region. But at least going into the summer of 1992, it appeared to us on the surface, Westgate Chapel had just settled into a lifestyle that I think can only be called desperately normal. I went into a particular Sunday, August 23rd, 1992, low in faith, zero expectation that anything was going to happen, that change anything, that God was going to show up. I was just at a low point. Fairly early in the service, a very credible gentleman in the congregation, well-known, well-established in the church as a faithful follower of Christ, spoke up. He believed that he had a word from the Lord for us. And as he spoke to the congregation that day, shared from the heart of God that God had heard the prayers of the people who had been faithfully in intercession in that congregation over the years.
I've heard you. I've heard you. You've been faithful in the birthing stall. You've been there. And I thought, yes, I have. And he said, I've heard you, and today is the day of breakthrough. You will remember this day. You will remember the songs you sang. You will remember that everything will be different.
God identified there were 3 kinds of soil in the lives of the people at Westgate Chapel. There was the hard soil. There was the fallow ground soil that was impenetrable even to the plow. And then there was the soil that readily yielded to the plow. God said that if we were willing to yield to His word and His leadership in our lives, that on that particular Sunday, He was going to provide Westgate Chapel with a breakthrough.
And we were just hit with joy. I would say joy.
And there is such a palpable sense of the Lord standing with you, and with, not literally, of course, but you sense there's this encompassing and embracing almost by the presence of Jesus.
Without anybody saying anything from the pulpit, the congregation began weeping up in the balcony on the main floor. There was just a spontaneous sense of response of repentance to what that gentleman had spoken, and a deep sense of repentance that has to be experienced. I don't think I can even explain it. And the only thing I felt prompted to do at that point was to open the altar area up of the congregation and invite the people who felt like they wanted to yield the soil of their lives to the Lord afresh, to come and take a time of prayer in that altar area. At one point I felt prompted, because there was such a sense of God's presence, to invite people to come forward who had never given their lives to Jesus Christ. And to my surprise, 25 people came forward at that point in the service to make a first-time profession of faith in Jesus Christ. You can imagine, with what I've described to you, the sense of awe there was and wonder at what God had done in our lives at that particular service. What I'd been trying to do for the first 4 years of my ministry at Westgate Chapel, God did in one Sunday morning service.
The thing that blessed me the most was that the leadership took it to heart. They didn't just let it pass by. They said, God spoke to us and said things would be different. Well, if things are going to be different, how are they going to be different? That's up to us.
The real challenge before us was what do we do now? Jesus said, my Father's house must be a house of prayer. I'm afraid, with all the best intentions, we've turned it into a house of preaching, house of Bible study, house of lots of activities. And the last thing that's happening in the American church is it's a house of prayer. So we felt that was the next thing to do, and as an appropriate response to what the Lord had done, would be to shut everything down for a season until prayer was clearly established as part of the lifestyle of Westgate Chapel. For the next 3 months, all Westgate Chapel did was meet for prayer on Wednesday nights and come together for Sunday services. Several things changed right away. In the Sunday services, there was an immediate transformation of worship. There was much more participation. It was much more spontaneous. It was not platform-driven. People were obviously experiencing God in their own lives in such a way that it changed their worship. People were coming to Christ on a regular basis. So the Sunday services changed almost immediately. The prayer meetings, I think, created an entire sense in the lives of the people that our lives are to be lived in dependence on the Lord. The Christian life is intended to be lived in a daily, responsive relationship to the Lord, where we hear from Him and He shapes and directs our daily activities and not just our Sunday services. And that began to permeate through the whole culture of the church, primarily, I believe, through the influence of the midweek prayer meetings. One of the incredible outcomes of the prayer meetings as they became a part of the life of the congregation was that they actually began to change the whole culture of the church. Instead of being primarily a white congregation in a white suburb of Seattle, we started getting people from different cultures coming in. Until today, we have 39 different nations represented in the congregation. We started getting more people who were broken and hurting, and their lifestyle and the way they looked reflected that they were coming from a broken and hurting background as God began to reach into their lives.
So as we came here, we were in a time of extreme pain, depression. Like Psalm 10:1 says, "Why are you so far away?" As we personally sat in the balcony and entered into the worship, the presence of the Lord, the presence of the Holy Spirit washed us. It washed our hearts. It washed our minds, and our hearts were restored, and our love for the Lord was restored, and our ability to trust leadership was restored.
By the end of December of 1992, prayer was established enough in the culture of Westgate Chapel. We were able at that point as a leadership to begin then reintroducing some of the very important ministries that had been set aside in the fall. Only now the leadership teams of those different ministries approached those ministries based on prayer and not just programming. I think it's important at this point to note that this work of God in Westgate Chapel in 1992 was not without resistance. 2 or 3 years into this new emphasis of prayer, the resistance had grown to a point where when one of the associate pastors felt genuinely called of the Lord to plant a church here in Seattle area, some 275 people decided that this would be a good opportunity for them to make their break and join this pastor in the church plant. And in a board meeting immediately preceding their departure, when we were wrestling with what we needed to do to prepare for or accommodate this sudden hole in the congregation, one of our deacons spoke a word of encouragement that I really believe was the Lord speaking to us, and not just the wisdom of this particular deacon. But he said, you know, he said to the board at the most fearful moment in that board meeting, he said, you know, I really believe that by the end of this month, those 270 people will be replaced, and we will not see any drop-off in giving. 1 month later, our attendance, which at that point was close to 2,000, was exactly where it had been before the 275 people left, and our giving, the financial records show our giving didn't suffer at all. So God miraculously replaced the people, the workers, and the finances as a miracle, I believe, of His provision. A lot of things have happened in the life of Westgate Chapel in the last 17 years. A lot of ministry, a lot of pain, a lot of mountaintop experiences. But the miracle of it has been that for 17 years now, God has clearly sustained the emphasis of prayer, the sense of His presence in ways that can't be explained by leadership style, worship style, human ingenuity. It's clearly, as witnessed by the testimonies of the people that you've heard from, it's clearly been the gracious work of God, who simply longs to respond to a people who call on His name. And it hasn't made us the fastest growing church in this area. It's not given us great sense of popularity or fame. That's after all, that's not what this is all about. This is about being followers of Jesus Christ. And God has accomplished that in miraculous ways over the last 17 years as He has sustained the ministry of prayer, so that Westgate Chapel can clearly be called a house of prayer.